She thought the janitor she married was too poor, too beneath her ambitions, so she dumped him to marry his boss, the man she believed owned the multi-billion-dollar technology empire where they worked. But what this woman didn't know was that the quiet janitor mopping floors beside her was actually the multi-billionaire founder who disguised himself to find genuine love. And the boss she'd betrayed him for was merely a mid-level manager he'd hired years ago. The janitor she'd mocked, belittled, and abandoned for being unable to afford her dreams had been signing her paychecks all along, living undercover in the company he'd built from nothing, watching and waiting to see if anyone could love him for who he was rather than what he owned. Now, as she planned her wedding to a man whose borrowed authority would crumble with a single phone call, the billionaire janitor prepared to reveal the devastating truth, a revelation that would shatter her gold-digging fantasy, crush the arrogant imposter who'd stolen his wife, and expose them both before the entire company they thought they'd conquered. But would he destroy them completely, or would the love he'd once felt stay his hand at the final moment? And what price would she pay for choosing a title over the truth, ambition over authenticity, when she discovered that the man scrubbing toilets had been the king all along? Rebecca Walsh adjusted her diamond-studded watch, a knockoff she'd bought online but passed off as genuine, and wrinkled her nose as she passed the supply closet on the executive floor of Titan Technologies. The smell of industrial cleaner drifted through the air, mingling with the antiseptic scent that reminded her daily of how far she still had to climb. She'd worked as the executive assistant to Thomas Bradford for 3 years now, positioning herself perfectly in the ecosystem of the company's upper management. Yet that final leap into true wealth remained frustratingly out of reach. Her heels clicked against the marble floor with practiced precision, each step a calculated performance of confidence she'd learned to manufacture during her 2 years of community college before dropping out to pursue what she called practical opportunities. The janitor rounded the corner pushing his cart, and Rebecca's jaw tightened involuntarily. Michael Walsh, her husband of 4 years, though she'd stopped wearing her ring 6 months ago. He wore the same navy blue uniform he'd worn every day since she'd met him at a company charity event where he'd been cleaning up after the guests. Back then, she'd thought his humility was charming, his gentle manner refreshing after a string of aggressive corporate climbers who'd used and discarded her. Back then, she'd believed love conquered all, that money didn't matter, that a good heart outweighed a healthy bank account. Back then, she'd been young and stupid. "Morning, Rebecca," Michael said softly, his gray eyes meeting hers with that same patient warmth that had first attracted her. He'd aged well in his late 30s, she noticed with irritation. His dark hair showed only hints of silver, his lean frame remained strong from the physical labor, and his face held a calmness that she'd once mistaken for wisdom, but now recognized as complacency. She didn't respond, simply brushed past him as though he were part of the furniture. Her phone buzzed with a text from Thomas, and her heart accelerated the way it always did when he contacted her. Thomas Bradford commanded attention whenever he entered a room, 6 feet tall, with silver-touched hair styled perfectly, wearing suits that cost more than Michael earned in 3 months, driving a Mercedes she'd admired through his office window countless times. Thomas represented everything she'd thought she wanted in a husband before she'd made the catastrophic mistake of marrying for love instead of ambition. The affair had started 8 months ago at an after-hours strategy meeting. Thomas had asked her to stay late, poured her expensive whiskey, complained about his lonely divorce, and kissed her against his desk with a hunger that had awakened something mercenary in her soul. Since then, they'd been conducting their relationship in expensive hotels, his luxury apartment, anywhere but near the company where discovery might complicate his position. He'd promised her everything: marriage once her situation was resolved, a promotion to junior executive, entrance into the social circles where real power concentrated. All she had to do was extract herself from the deadweight husband who cleaned toilets for minimum wage. Michael watched his wife disappear into Thomas's office, and something ancient and tired settled over his features. He'd known about the affair within 2 weeks of its beginning, had known because he'd installed the security systems throughout the building, because he monitored every access point, because nothing happened in Titan Technologies without his awareness. He'd watched his marriage disintegrate through camera feeds, and overheard conversations, had seen Rebecca transform from the woman who'd cried during their vows into someone he barely recognized. What she didn't know, what nobody except his lawyer and oldest friend knew, was that Michael Walsh had founded Titan Technologies 11 years ago in a garage with borrowed equipment and a revolutionary approach to cloud infrastructure. He'd built the company from nothing into an empire worth $47 billion, had navigated it through 3 major acquisitions and 2 recessions, had created thousands of jobs and changed how the world stored and accessed data. And then 5 years ago, exhausted by the endless parade of people who wanted something from him, who saw his wealth before his humanity, who performed friendship and love with transparent desperation, he'd made a radical decision. He'd hired a management team, stepped back from public operations, and assumed a disguise so complete that even his own wife didn't recognize the man she'd married. He'd created the Michael Walsh identity, complete with fabricated employment history, modest apartment, and working-class background, specifically to find someone who might love him for himself rather than his billions. He'd volunteered at that charity event specifically because Rebecca had caught his eye during a presentation. Her intelligence and drive evident even then, her beauty understated and natural in a room full of surgical enhancements and designer desperation. For 3 years before their marriage and the first year after, he'd believed he'd found something real. Rebecca had seemed different, focused on building a life together, talking about children and dreams that didn't require private jets or vacation homes. He'd been preparing to reveal the truth, had planned an elaborate surprise where he'd show her everything and prove that love had been the right choice all along. Then he'd noticed the changes, the way her eyes followed Thomas Bradford through the halls with calculating assessment, the sudden interest in designer labels and luxury brands, the growing contempt in her voice when she spoke about their tiny apartment and limited lifestyle, the ring that disappeared from her finger, the late nights that smelled of expensive cologne and hotel soap. Thomas Bradford had no idea who Michael really was. The man thought he was a senior vice president reporting to a board of directors, thought his employment contract and generous salary represented the pinnacle of the company hierarchy. Michael had hired him 7 years ago specifically because Thomas was competent but not curious, ambitious but not visionary. Someone who'd run operations smoothly without asking uncomfortable questions about ownership structure or corporate governance. Thomas had no idea that his employment, his salary, his authority existed entirely at Michael's pleasure and could be revoked with a phone call. Michael pushed his cart down the hallway, his mind calculating through scenarios and consequences. He'd spent months wrestling with what to do, whether to reveal the truth and save his marriage or let it die naturally. Every time he'd been ready to intervene, to expose Thomas or confront Rebecca, something had stopped him, some last vestige of the love that had started this experiment, some desperate hope that she might remember who they'd been and choose him again without knowing about the money. But this morning, eavesdropping through the cleaning frequency on his radio that patched into the building's communication system, he'd heard Thomas and Rebecca planning their future with brutal specificity. She was filing divorce papers next week. He was promoting her immediately afterward to avoid accusations of favoritism. They were getting married in 3 months at an exclusive venue he'd already booked. She'd laughed about her loser husband, who probably couldn't even afford to contest the divorce, much less hire a decent lawyer. That laugh had crystallized something in Michael's chest, had transformed heartbreak into something colder and more purposeful. He'd built an empire through strategic patience, had outmaneuvered competitors and skeptics through careful planning and perfect timing. Now he'd apply those same skills to the 2 people who'd betrayed him most completely. Thomas Bradford leaned back in his leather chair and smiled at Rebecca as she closed the door behind her. She'd worn the blue dress he liked, the one that showcased her figure without being inappropriate for the office, and her blonde hair fell in carefully styled waves that had probably taken an hour to perfect. He appreciated the effort she put into their relationship, the way she managed to be both professionally competent and personally available, never demanding too much or questioning his authority. "Did you make the reservation?" Rebecca asked, settling into the chair across from his desk with practiced elegance. They'd learned to conduct their personal business in careful code, conversations that could be explained away as work-related if anyone overheard. Saturday at 8, Thomas confirmed. The venue coordinator says everything will be perfect. 3 months isn't much time, but when you have the right connections, things move faster. Rebecca's smile could have powered the building's lighting system. This was everything she'd wanted since childhood. Watching her mother work 3 jobs to keep them in a shabby apartment while her father drank away his construction salary. She'd sworn she'd never struggle like that, never settle for less than luxury, never let love trap her in poverty the way it had trapped her mother. Michael had been a mistake, a romantic detour when she'd been too young to know better. Thomas was the correction, the path to the life she deserved. "I'm filing papers on Monday," she said quietly. "My lawyer says it'll be straightforward since we don't have assets to divide. Michael won't fight it. He knows he can't afford to." What neither of them could see was Michael standing just outside Thomas's door, cleaning the same section of hallway he'd cleaned 15 minutes earlier, listening through the frequency that fed directly into his wireless earpiece. What they couldn't know was that every word they spoke was being recorded through systems Michael himself had designed, archived in servers that would preserve their betrayal in perfect digital clarity. Michael had learned patience-building Titan technologies, had understood that the right moment executed perfectly was worth more than 1,000 impulsive actions. He'd waited years to launch products, had delayed acquisitions until conditions aligned perfectly, had built a reputation for strategic brilliance that his competitors called almost supernatural. Now he'd apply that same discipline to destroying the 2 people who'd thought him too insignificant to fear. He pushed his cart toward the elevator, his mind already constructing the sequence of revelations that would unravel their lives with mathematical precision. First would come the documentation, evidence of their affair comprehensive enough to invalidate any claims of professional propriety. Then the corporate restructuring that would strip Thomas of his position and authority, making Rebecca's promotion impossible and exposing them both to company-wide scrutiny. Finally, the personal revelation that would show Rebecca exactly what she traded away, what her contempt and betrayal had cost her. But even as he planned their destruction, Michael felt something complicated stirring beneath the anger. He'd loved Rebecca once, genuinely loved her in ways that money had never been able to purchase. Part of him still remembered the woman who'd fallen asleep on his shoulder during movies, who'd talked about opening a bookstore someday, who'd kissed him in the rain outside their first apartment and said she'd never been happier. That woman was still somewhere inside the calculating stranger who'd taken her place, wasn't she? Or had the transformation been complete, the original Rebecca consumed entirely by ambition and greed? The elevator doors closed, and Michael caught his reflection in the polished steel. He looked like exactly what he was pretending to be, a middle-aged janitor with tired eyes and calloused hands, someone the world had trained itself not to see. Perfect camouflage for a billionaire who'd learned that wealth exposed you to endless performance, that everyone wanted something, that genuine connection required the removal of everything that defined you in society's eyes. His phone buzzed with a message from David Chen, his lawyer and the only person who knew the complete truth. The message was brief. Final confirmation needed before proceeding with revelation protocol. This can't be undone once initiated. Are you certain? Michael stared at the message for a long moment, his thumb hovering over the reply option. One word would set everything in motion, would transform him from invisible janitor back into the billionaire founder, would expose Thomas and Rebecca to consequences they couldn't imagine. One word would end the experiment that had consumed 5 years of his life, would prove that his cynicism had been justified all along, that love without knowledge of wealth was as impossible as he'd feared. But he didn't type that word yet. Instead, he pocketed the phone and returned to his work, pushing his cart through hallways where executives rushed past without seeing him, where his wife laughed in another man's office about divorcing the poor loser she'd mistakenly married. He'd wait until Monday, would give Rebecca one final weekend to remember who they'd been, would offer her one last chance to choose the truth over the lie. If she filed those papers, if she walked into that lawyer's office and destroyed their marriage for Thomas Bradford's empty promises, then he'd unleash everything. But if some part of her hesitated, if some fragment of the woman he'd loved surfaced in these final days, then maybe, just maybe, There was still something worth saving beneath the wreckage of what they'd become. Michael cleaned the executive floor with methodical precision, invisible and ignored. A billionaire pretending to be poor while his wife prepared to abandon him for a man pretending to be rich. The irony was so perfect it was almost beautiful. The tragedy was that Rebecca had no idea that the man scrubbing her floors had been the king all along. That her contempt for his poverty was contempt for a disguise so complete she'd married it without ever questioning what might lie beneath. The weekend began with rain hammering against the windows of the modest two-bedroom apartment Michael had maintained throughout his marriage. Rebecca had stopped coming home most nights, preferring to stay at Thomas's luxury penthouse with its panoramic city views and imported marble floors. But tonight, surprisingly, she'd returned, moving through their shared space with the detached efficiency of someone visiting a place they'd already abandoned emotionally. Michael sat on their worn couch, bought secondhand during their first year of marriage, and watched his wife pack designer clothes into expensive luggage that Thomas had probably purchased. She moved through the bedroom with brisk efficiency, separating her life from his with the cold practicality of someone executing a business transaction. Every movement drove small knives into Michael's chest, not because he still loved her, that had died somewhere between the affair's beginning and her mocking laughter about his poverty, but because each gesture confirmed how completely he'd failed in his experiment. "I'll be out by Sunday evening," Rebecca said without looking at him. "My lawyer will contact you Monday about the divorce papers. I'm not asking for anything. You don't have anything worth taking anyway." The contempt in her voice was casual, automatic, as though his worthlessness was so obvious it required no emphasis. Michael absorbed it silently, his face showing nothing of the calculations running behind his eyes. He'd built a $47 billion empire by reading people accurately, by understanding motivations and predicting behaviors with algorithmic precision. Rebecca's transformation wasn't mysterious. She'd always wanted wealth and status, had simply convinced herself temporarily that love might substitute for luxury. The moment Thomas had offered her an entrance into the world she'd always craved, her true nature had reasserted itself with brutal clarity. "Can I ask you something?" Michael said quietly, his voice carrying none of the authority that had commanded boardrooms and negotiated billion-dollar deals. "When did you stop loving me? When did I become something you needed to escape?" Rebecca paused, a silk blouse halfway into her suitcase. For just a moment, something flickered across her face. Guilt, maybe, or the ghost of affection. But it vanished quickly, replaced by the hardened determination that had characterized her these past months. "I don't know if I ever really loved you," she said, and the honesty was somehow worse than deliberate cruelty would have been. "I loved the idea of you, maybe. The humble, kind-hearted man who didn't care about money or status. But that stops being romantic when you're 32 years old and still living paycheck to paycheck. When your friends are buying houses and taking vacations and building real lives while you're worrying about utility bills." "We could have built something," Michael offered, testing her, giving her one final opportunity to see beyond the surface. "If you told me what you needed, what you wanted, what could you have given me?" Rebecca interrupted, her laugh sharp and bitter. "Another year in this apartment? Another decade of thrift store furniture and discount groceries?" "I wanted more, Michael. I deserved more. And Thomas can give me everything you never could." Michael nodded slowly, something final settling into place behind his ribs. He'd wondered if there might be some scenario where revelation changed things, where showing her the truth might undo the betrayal. But her words confirmed what he'd suspected. Rebecca hadn't fallen out of love with him. She'd fallen in love with what she thought Thomas represented: the money, the status, the entrance into a world she'd always coveted. Showing her that he'd possessed those things all along wouldn't repair what was broken. It would only prove that her values were exactly as shallow as they appeared. "I hope you find what you're looking for," Michael said finally, and meant it in ways she couldn't comprehend. He hoped she found exactly what she'd chosen, that she lived with the full consequences of trading substance for appearance, authenticity for performance. Rebecca zipped her suitcase and moved toward the door, pausing only to leave her keys on the kitchen counter. "I'm sorry it ended this way," she said, but the apology was reflexive, empty of genuine remorse. "You're a good person, Michael. You deserve someone who wants the simple life you're offering. That person just isn't me." The door closed behind her with a finality that echoed through the apartment. Michael sat in the silence for a long moment, processing the end of a marriage that had been over for months, but was only now officially dying. Then he pulled out his phone and typed a single word to David Chen. "Proceed." The response came immediately. "Monday morning, 9 a.m. Corporate headquarters, main conference room. All documentation has been prepared. All parties have been notified. Are you ready?" Michael looked around the apartment that had been his hiding place, his laboratory for testing humanity's capacity for genuine connection. He'd learned what he needed to learn, had confirmed his darkest suspicions about wealth and authenticity. The experiment was complete. Now came the revelation, the exposure, the moment when the janitor removed his disguise and showed the world what had been hidden in plain sight all along. "Ready," he typed back. "Let's show them what they couldn't see." Thomas Bradford spent Sunday afternoon at his country club, networking with executives and investors who saw him as a rising star in the technology sector. He'd cultivated this image carefully over his 7 years at Titan Technologies, positioning himself as a key decision-maker, allowing people to assume he held more authority than his actual title suggested. The strategy had served him well, had opened doors, generated opportunities, and now had delivered Rebecca Walsh, beautiful and ambitious, exactly the kind of wife who'd complement his rise to genuine power. He'd originally planned to wait before leaving his current position to build his resume for another year before pursuing CEO roles at smaller companies. But with Rebecca motivating him, with her connections and intelligence supporting his ambitions, he'd begun to think bigger. Perhaps he'd demand a promotion, leverage his essential status to extract more authority from the mysterious board that controlled Titan's highest levels. Perhaps with Rebecca beside him, he'd finally break through to the inner circle he'd never quite managed to access. His phone buzzed with a message from Rebecca, a photo of her new apartment, luxurious and bright, with a caption that read, "Our future starts now." Thomas smiled and ordered another scotch, imagining the life they'd build together. Power couple, society pages, the kind of influence that translated to real wealth rather than just salary. He'd made a good choice pursuing her, had recognized her potential early, and positioned himself perfectly to benefit from her trajectory. What Thomas Bradford didn't know, what he couldn't know because he'd never bothered to question the fundamental structure of the company he worked for, was that his entire position existed in a corporate shadow. He reported to a board that didn't make decisions, managed divisions that operated on autopilot, signed documents that had no real authority. He was a figurehead, maintained by the actual owner as useful camouflage, given just enough responsibility to feel important while never accessing the genuine levers of power. Monday morning would shatter that illusion with surgical precision. Michael spent Sunday evening in his real home, a modernist mansion in the hills overlooking the city, purchased anonymously through shell corporations and visited only when he was certain no one was watching. The contrast between this space and the modest apartment was almost absurd. Soaring ceilings, original artwork, technology integrated so seamlessly it was nearly invisible. This was what $47 billion looked like when you didn't need to prove anything to anyone. David Chen arrived at 7 with a briefcase full of documentation and a tablet displaying the presentation they'd prepared. He was a thin, intense man in his 50s who'd been Michael's roommate in college and had helped structure every major deal that built Titan Technologies. More than a lawyer, he was the architect of Michael's disappearing act, the only person who'd supported the experiment even while questioning its wisdom. "Last chance to reconsider," David said, spreading documents across Michael's marble dining table. "Once we initiate this tomorrow, there's no walking it back. Rebecca will know what she lost. Thomas will lose everything he thought he had. The entire company will know you've been there all along watching." Michael studied the evidence they'd compiled. Time-stamped photographs of Thomas and Rebecca in hotels, expense reports showing company money funding their affair, text messages discussing their future while mocking the pathetic janitor Rebecca was married to. Most damning were the recordings from Thomas's office, conversations where he discussed leveraging his relationship with the board to secure Rebecca's promotion, where he joked about the poor fool cleaning floors while his wife planned a better future. She had months to choose differently, Michael said quietly. Every time I cleaned that hallway, every time she walked past me like I was invisible, every time I heard her laugh about my poverty, those were choices, David. Active decisions to value appearance over substance, money over character. Tomorrow isn't punishment, it's revelation. I'm just showing them what was always true. David nodded slowly. And after? When they know, when the company knows, when Rebecca understands that the janitor she dumped was actually the billionaire founder, what then? Do you think revelation will hurt more than the divorce would have? I don't want it to hurt, Michael said, though he wasn't certain that was entirely true. I want it to teach. I want Rebecca to understand what she traded away, what her contempt cost her. I want Thomas to learn that authority without substance is just performance. And I want everyone else in that company to see what I saw, that wealth distorts everything, that people can't be trusted to love what they can't see, that my experiment failed exactly as cynically as I'd feared. That's a lot of weight to put on one revelation, David observed, and it doesn't leave much room for mercy, for the possibility that people make mistakes without being irredeemable. Michael met his friend's eyes, something ancient and sad moving behind his expression. If Rebecca had shown any hesitation, any doubt about divorcing me, any fragment of the woman I married, I would have stopped this. I gave her every opportunity to choose love over money. She chose money every time. That's not a mistake, David. That's character. The tablet on the table displayed the conference room schedule. 9 a.m. Monday morning, mandatory executive meeting, all senior staff required to attend. Thomas Bradford would walk into that room expecting a routine strategy session. Rebecca would be there as his assistant, probably already wearing the ring he'd given her this weekend. They'd sit together, confident in their future, unaware that the janitor who'd cleaned that conference room for years was about to remove his disguise and show them exactly what they couldn't see. Michael's phone buzzed with a message from Rebecca, forwarded through their shared cell plan. It was addressed to one of her friends. Finally free tomorrow. Papers filing at 10. Michael was sweet but too poor to build a real life with. Thomas is everything I should have chosen from the start. Successful, ambitious, actually going somewhere. The janitor thing was cute until it became my entire reality. David saw Michael read the message, saw something final settle into his friend's features. Still think mercy is warranted? Michael asked quietly. No, David admitted. I suppose not. Some lessons can only be learned through consequences. They worked through the night finalizing details, rehearsing the sequence of revelations, ensuring that every piece of evidence was airtight and irrefutable. By dawn, they'd constructed a presentation that would systematically dismantle Thomas Bradford's authority and expose Rebecca's betrayal, all while revealing the truth that had been hidden for 5 years, that the janitor cleaning their floors had been the king all along, watching and waiting to see if anyone could love him for who he was beneath the wealth. At 8:45 Monday morning, Michael Walsh put on a suit for the first time in 5 years. It was custom-tailored Italian wool, conservatively cut but unmistakably expensive, the kind of suit that announced authority without needing to prove it. He studied himself in the mirror and barely recognized the man looking back, not because the disguise had been so complete, but because the weight of what he was about to do showed in his eyes, aging him in ways that had nothing to do with years. "Ready?" David asked from the doorway, his own suit immaculate, his briefcase containing the ammunition that would destroy 2 lives before lunch. "No," Michael admitted, "but necessary anyway." They drove to Titan Technologies in Michael's actual car, a Tesla Model S that had been sitting in a private garage for years, maintained but unused during his time as the invisible janitor. The building rose against the morning sky like a monument to ambition, 47 stories of glass and steel housing, thousands of employees who had no idea their founder was about to reappear. Michael used his private entrance, a key card that still worked despite years of disuse, taking them directly to the executive floor. He could hear voices in the conference room, Thomas holding court while Rebecca organized materials. neither of them aware that their entire world was about to invert. At exactly 9 o'clock, Michael opened the conference room door and walked inside. The conversations died immediately, confusion rippling through the assembled executives as they tried to process why their janitor was wearing a suit that cost more than most of their monthly salaries, why he was carrying himself with sudden authority that seemed to radiate from his posture. Thomas recovered first, standing with practiced dominance. "I don't know what you think you're doing, Walsh, but this is a private executive meeting. You need to leave immediately, or I'll have security remove you." "Sit down, Thomas," Michael said quietly, his voice carrying none of the deference that had characterized his janitor persona. "You don't have the authority you think you do. You never did." Rebecca was staring at him with something approaching horror, her mind clearly struggling to reconcile the humble janitor she'd married with this transformed figure who moved through the room like he owned it. Which, of course, he did. Owned the room, the building, the company, everything. David connected his tablet to the conference room display, and Michael's photograph appeared on the screen. Not the candid shot from his employee badge, but his official portrait from the company's founding documents. Beneath the image, text displayed his full name and title. Michael Anthony Walsh, founder and CEO, Titan Technologies. "What is this?" Thomas demanded, though his voice had lost its certainty, authority cracking as he processed implications his mind wasn't quite ready to accept. "This is revelation," Michael said simply. "This is me showing you what you couldn't see, what you never bothered to look for. I founded Titan Technologies 11 years ago, built it from nothing into what you see today. 5 years ago, I stepped back from public operations and created the Michael Walsh identity, the janitor identity, specifically to see if anyone in this company could value substance over appearance, could love a person rather than a position." The conference room had gone completely silent, every executive frozen as they recalculated their entire understanding of the company's structure. Michael could see the realization dawning on their faces, the sudden comprehension of how thoroughly they'd been deceived. "Rebecca," Michael continued, turning to his wife, who had gone pale as comprehension destroyed her carefully constructed future. "You knew me for 7 years, married me for 4. In all that time, did you ever wonder why I seemed educated beyond my position? Why I understood business strategy and corporate finance? Why I never seemed worried about money despite a janitor's salary?" She couldn't speak, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly as her mind worked through implications that were destroying her piece by piece. The man she'd mocked for poverty was the billionaire founder. The loser she'd divorced for being beneath her ambitions had been signing her paychecks all along. Thomas Bradford, the successful executive she'd traded everything for, was nothing but a middle management figurehead with borrowed authority. "This is impossible," Thomas managed finally, though his voice carried no conviction. I report to the board." "There is no board," Michael interrupted. "There's me, and there's a legal structure designed to let me operate in shadow. You report to managers who report to directors, who report to vice presidents who all ultimately answer to me. You're a senior vice president, Thomas, which means you're 4 levels below actual authority. You run operations because I chose to let you, because you're competent enough to keep things stable, while I observe from the floor you never bothered to notice." David advanced the presentation, and suddenly the screen filled with evidence. Photographs of Thomas and Rebecca in hotels, expense reports documenting their affair funded partially by company money, text messages planning their future while mocking the pathetic janitor. Every executive in the room could see it, could understand exactly what had been happening under the veneer of professional propriety. "You used company resources to conduct an affair with my wife," Michael said, his voice still quiet but carrying absolute authority now. "You discussed promoting her based on your personal relationship rather than merit. You mocked me, your actual employer, while planning to benefit from authority you never possessed. And Rebecca, you traded a genuine relationship for what you thought was wealth and status, never realizing you already had access to more wealth than you could spend in 10 lifetimes. Rebecca found her voice finally, though it came out broken. "You lied to me. You pretended to be poor. That's not fair. That's not fair," Michael interrupted, and for the first time anger leaked into his tone. I gave you every opportunity to love me without money distorting the relationship. Every day we were together, I was the same person, kind, loyal, devoted to building a life with you. The only thing that changed was your perception of my bank account. You didn't fall out of love with me, Rebecca. You fell out of love with poverty. There's a difference. What happens now? Thomas asked, his voice hollow as he understood his entire life was collapsing in real time. You destroy us? Ruin our careers? Make us pay for, what, falling in love? Michael studied the man who'd been sleeping with his wife, who joked about the janitor cleaning his office while planning a future built on betrayal. He'd imagined this moment for months, had constructed elaborate scenarios of revenge and exposure. But now, standing here watching them break, he felt only exhaustion and a strange, sad clarity. Thomas, you're fired, Michael said simply. Effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. I'll provide you with a reference that accurately describes your competence in operations management, but nothing more. What you do with that is up to you. Thomas opened his mouth to argue, but David gestured to the door where security personnel were already waiting. The man who'd thought himself powerful left the conference room in shame, his borrowed authority stripped away in seconds, exposing the middle manager beneath the performance. Michael turned to Rebecca, who was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks as she understood the magnitude of what she'd lost. You wanted the divorce, he said quietly. You'll get it. I won't contest anything. Won't make it difficult. But you don't get the promotion Thomas promised. You don't get access to wealth you divorced me to pursue. You get exactly what you thought you'd get when you left the poor janitor. Nothing. Michael, please, Rebecca whispered. If I'd known, if you'd just told me, if you'd known, you would have stayed for the money. Michael interrupted. That's exactly the problem, Rebecca. I needed to know if anyone could love me without it, without the performance and the pretending. You proved they couldn't. You proved my cynicism was justified all along. He nodded to David, who began distributing folders to the other executives in the room. Inside, you'll find organizational charts showing the actual corporate structure, contact information for reaching me directly, and explanations for why I maintain this disguise. Effective immediately, I'm resuming public control of Titan Technologies. We'll be making significant changes to company culture, compensation structures, and promotion criteria to emphasize substance over appearance. Michael walked to the door, then paused and turned back to Rebecca one final time. She looked destroyed, her careful makeup smeared, her designer dress suddenly seeming like costume rather than armor. The woman he'd loved was still in there somewhere, he supposed, buried under ambition and regret. But that woman had made her choices, had valued appearance over authenticity, money over love. I really did love you, Michael said quietly. The man you married, the janitor you mocked, that was me without the money complicating things. That was the most honest version of myself I've ever shown anyone. And you chose to destroy it for a fantasy, for borrowed status, for everything that doesn't matter. I hope Thomas's penthouse was worth it. I hope the luxury was worth trading for something that could have been real. He left before she could respond, walked out of the conference room that had witnessed his revelation, moved through hallways where employees were already whispering about the transformed janitor who turned out to be their founder. David followed quietly, giving Michael space to process what they'd just done. Outside in the parking lot, Michael paused beside his Tesla and looked back at the building he'd created. 47 stories of ambition and innovation, thousands of employees pursuing dreams and building futures, all of it resting on foundations he'd laid when he was barely 30 years old. He'd built something extraordinary, had changed the world in small but meaningful ways, and he'd been willing to risk it all on an experiment in authenticity, a test of whether love could exist separate from wealth. The experiment had failed. Rebecca had proven that money mattered more than character, that status trumped substance, that people couldn't be trusted to love what they couldn't see. His cynicism had been vindicated completely. So why did victory feel so much like grief? What now? David asked quietly. You've exposed them, revealed yourself, proved your point. What comes after revelation? Michael climbed into his car and started the engine, not yet sure where he was driving. Now I figure out if there's any point in being authentic when authenticity just teaches you how alone you really are, he said finally. Now I accept that the janitor was the only version of me anyone might have loved genuinely, and even that wasn't enough once poverty became inconvenient. He drove away from Titan Technologies, leaving behind the company he'd built and the wife he'd lost, heading toward a future that stretched before him with hollow certainty. He had $47 billion, complete corporate authority, and absolute proof that his darkest fears about wealth and connection had been accurate all along. The janitor she dumped for being too poor had been the multi-billionaire founder wearing the most elaborate disguise she'd never bothered to see through. And now that the truth was revealed, now that she understood what she'd traded away, the knowledge would crush her exactly as completely as she'd crushed the gentle man who'd loved her before wealth complicated everything. Michael had won. He'd destroyed them, exposed their betrayal, proved his point with mathematical precision. But as he drove through the city toward his empty mansion in the hills, he couldn't escape the feeling that he'd lost something far more valuable than anything he'd taken from Thomas and Rebecca. He'd lost the last hope that authenticity might matter more than appearance, that someone might love the janitor even after learning he'd been the king all along.